Hello, I'm Daniel Kilkelly, and this is my issues report on the state of book banning. School and public libraries are facing increased pressure to restrict the content in their collections. The First Amendment right of students to receive information is, in theory, protected by the decision of the Supreme Court in Island Tree School District v. Pico. However, modern pressure campaigns from conservative political groups and state and local level legislation have presented new and unique challenges to intellectual freedom. Challenges to library materials have been on the rise in recent years. The American Library Association reported that trend continuing in 2023. From the ALA, the new numbers released today show efforts to censor 4,240 unique book titles in schools and libraries. This tops the previous high from 2022, when 2,571 unique titles were targeted for censorship. Overwhelmingly, books challenged have been by or about marginalized communities. Also from ALA, titles representing the voices and lived experience of LGBTQIA+ and BIPOC individuals made up 47% of those targeted in censorship attempts. Another report by PEN America further dissects the reasons why books are being challenged. During the first half of the 2022 to 2023 school year, PEN America identified 30% of challenged books that deal with race, racism, or featured people of color were challenged, while 26% have LGBTQIA+ characters or themes. However, other topics are beginning to crop up. From PEN America, bans this school year are increasingly affecting a wider swath of titles, including those that portray violence and abuse at 44%, discuss topics of health and well-being at 38%, and cover death and grief at 30%. So is it legal to remove books based solely on the disapproval of the subject matter, or are these decisions in violation of the First Amendment rights of library users? The Supreme Court addressed this issue in the Island Trees School District v. Pico case. In this case, the school board for the Island Trees School District removed several books which the board characterized as anti-American, anti-Christian, anti-Semitic, and just plain filthy from the Supreme Court case. So it started local, worked its way up to the Supreme Court, which produced a fractured opinion. A plurality determined the following from the Supreme Court case, relying on cases such as West Virginia State Board of Education v. Barnett in 1943 and Tinker v. Des Moines Independent Community School District in 1969. Justice Brennan's opinion reaffirmed that though local school boards have broad discretion in the management of school affairs, that discretion must be exercised in a manner that comports with the transcendent imperatives of the First Amendment. And this is from the Free Speech Center at Middle Tennessee State University. So Justice Brennan then concluded that school officials may not exercise their discretion to remove books from a school library based on narrowly partisan or political grounds, because doing so would amount to an official suppression of ideas. And he points out that students have the right to receive information and ideas. However, 4 justices dissented in this case. The dissents argued that removing books from school libraries did not implicate any First Amendment rights because books were available elsewhere. The, quote, right to receive information does not apply in the context of a school, and federal courts should leave educational policy decisions to local government officials subject to democratic accountability. 3 of the petitioners who brought the case, Richard Ahrens, Frank Martin, and Patrick Hughes, had in September of 1975 attended a conference sponsored by the Parents of New York, or Pony U, a politically conservative organization of parents concerned about education legislation in the state of New York, the Supreme Court case notes. At this conference, they received lists of potentially objectionable books and discovered that several of them were in the school's library collection, setting off this case. These conditions are echoed today with politically conservative organizations pressuring libraries and local governments and distributing lists of objectionable books, albeit on a greater scale. PEN America identifies the most prolific of these groups here. Of the national groups, Moms for Liberty, formed in 2021, has spread most broadly with over 200 local chapters identified on their website. Other national groups with branches inside the U.S. includes U.S. Parents Involved in Education with 50 chapters, No Left Turn in Education with 25, Mass Resistance with 16, Parents' Rights in Education with 12, Mary in the Library with 9, County Citizens Defending Freedom USA with 5, and Power to Parents with 5. However, it isn't just organizations like these that target books for removal. Texas State Representative Matt Krause compiled a list of 850 books targeting books that might make kids feel discomfort or distress because of their race or sex, and distributed this list to schools statewide, asking if they had these books in their collection, according to NPR. He also asked where they were located and how much money was spent on them. These two factors, politically conservative organizations challenging books and lists of books being circulated, echo the PICO case. However, in the present day, there is also legislation at the state level to remove books. In 2023, Texas passed the Reader Act, which stands for Restricting Explicit and Adult Designated Educational Resources. From the Act, HB 900 defines sexually explicit and sexually relevant materials and requires library material vendors, any entity that sells library materials to a public school in Texas, to assign sexually explicit and sexually relevant ratings to any material the vendor determines meet the law's definitions. Also from the case, vendors must issue ratings for materials previously sold to Texas school districts that are in active use and must recall library materials sold to a district that the vendor has rated explicit. And this is from the Texas Library Association's summary of the law. The Reader Act was signed into law last year on June 13th, 2023. It required Texas booksellers who sold to schools to rate their books, both those actively being sold to schools and those previously sold to schools, by April 1st of 2024. Once the ratings were issued, the Texas Education Agency could review the rating and, if they disagreed, compel the vendor to change the rating. If the vendor failed to comply within 60 days, they would be placed on a non-compliance list and were forbidden from selling to schools. In challenging the law, several Texas booksellers likened this to compelled speech and argued that it would cause them irreparable financial damage as they take on the task of reviewing and rating every single book they have sold or will sell. Enforcement of the book rating part of the law was shot down in the courts by the United States Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit. However, another part of the Reader Act was left intact, which affected collection development, which we can see from the law. The standards must, in relevant part, prohibit school districts from possessing, purchasing, or acquiring harmful material as defined by the state's penal code, library material rated sexually explicit by the vendor, or library material that is pervasively vulgar or educationally unsuitable as referenced in PICO v. Board of Education. So while the state could not compel the vendor to rate books, it could still restrict schools' ability to acquire books. So this point about the school's discretion to limit the acquisition compared to the removal is echoed in PICO v. Board of Education. The decision to return the removed books to the shelves was based on the right of students to, quote, freely receive information. However, in Justice Rehnquist's dissent, he identifies the contradiction. The failure of a library to acquire a book denies access to contents just as effectively as does the removal of a book from the school's library shelf. As a result of either action, the book cannot be found in the principal locus of freedom discovered by Justice Brennan, and that's from the Supreme Court case. He points this out to disagree with the right of students in a school library to freely receive information, but also predicts a more insidious threat from book banning, the chilling effect of censorship. Book bans, coordinated political groups, widely distributed lists of objectionable materials, and state-sponsored restrictions on library collections, even if they're at times found unconstitutional, create an environment of fear among educators and librarians. At times, laws even explicitly attack librarians, like in Missouri. PEN America notes, in Missouri, a law that was originally written to create important new protections for sexual assault survivors, SB 775, was amended before passage to include a provision making it a Class A misdemeanor for librarians or teachers to provide explicit sexual material to a student, from PEN America. As a result, libraries making collection development decisions are likely to shy away from potentially controversial books in order to avoid having the book pulled or legal action against them. The shaky footing for the plurality decision in PICO v. Board of Education, as well as the broad discretion afforded to schools to make collection-related decisions, makes it difficult to uphold the tenets of intellectual freedom within school libraries. While the American Library Association's Library Bill of Rights is clear in its unwavering support to intellectual freedom and unrestricted access to ideas, even if those ideas might be controversial or unpopular, it is not legally binding. School boards, library boards, and state and local governments may disregard it entirely unless and until a new, stronger precedent than PICO is set. So, what can be done to uphold the tenets of intellectual freedom in libraries? Cases like the Texas book rating law are being challenged and at times rejected by the courts. In the meantime, the influence of highly motivated conservative political organizations can be mirrored with equal motivation from freedom to read advocates. What can be done by a majority in the legislature or on a board can be undone if the balance of power shifts. This means being active in elections at every level, especially at the local level, with careful attention being paid to school and library boards. With the proper support from these boards, collection development policies can be rewritten to include statements of support for the Library Bill of Rights. The process to challenge books can be streamlined to combat abuse by national groups. While the challenge process has legitimate uses and is an important part of a library policy, it can be limited to people who live within the library's district, or in the case of schools, to people who have children in those schools. Challenges can also be limited to one book at a time per patron to ease the burdens on the librarians who must address every challenge, as well as to prevent challenges to multiple books. And a lot of these suggestions are because these things are being abused, like people giving long lists of books to challenge, or challenging books that are in a district where they don't have kids going to school there. At the school level, sometimes compromise might be necessary with these parents' rights groups. For example, providing parents access to information about what their children are checking out, an opt-out process that would allow parents to restrict the ability of their children to use the library, or the more restrictive opt-in process that would require parental consent to use the library. These are not ideal, as the Library Bill of Rights highlights patron privacy and confidentiality in their library use and says that library use should not be denied or abridged based on age. However, these solutions are preferable to removing controversial items from library shelves entirely and denying everybody access. There are also legislative solutions to mirror the restrictive ones in states like Texas and Missouri. Illinois passed HB 2789, which required state libraries to adopt the Library Bill of Rights, a law which essentially bans book bans, and other states may follow suit. However, the Washington Post reports that over the summer, state libraries in Montana, Missouri, and Texas announced that they were severing ties with the ALA, imperiling their libraries' access to funding and training. And that was summer of 2023. The organization as a whole has taken on some of the political fallout of book bans. The primary solution to this issue seems to be to weather the onslaught of challenges and keep voting and fighting for intellectual freedom. As the American Library Association found out in its 2022 study, 71% of voters oppose book banning in public libraries, and 67% of voters oppose book banning in school libraries. So by engaging freedom to read advocates, strengthening existing policies, voting for candidates who will protect intellectual freedom, and challenging book banning in court, we can fight to uphold the principles core to libraries and the profession. Thank you for coming to my Not TED Talk.